Welcome to F4 Talks again. With me is Gary Grappo, our former chair, our board member, retired US ambassador, and a top man, especially on the Middle East. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you, Atul. It's always good to be with you.
Thank you, sir. Gary, today we are discussing America's new fast-changing role in the Middle East. Before we discuss this new fast-changing role, we have to first delve into what was America's role in the Middle East. And given the fact that the British had an empire and the French had an empire in the Middle East, after divvying up the spoils of the Ottoman Empire, thanks to the thanks to two gentlemen, Mr. Sykes and Miss Upiko, who divvied up the spoils. It's important to see when America emerges on the scene, and that's after World War II. So let's get into what was America's role, and then we get into what is its new role. So educate us what happens when America is the winning top dog in World War II.
Well, as you indicated, Atul, the United States, in terms of great powers, is a relative newcomer to the Middle East. Prior to 1945, the only experience that we had there, of course, is during the North African campaign, fighting alongside the British in the 1940s, World War II. Otherwise, it was really confined to trade, setting up some universities and the work of missionaries. And it wasn't until 1945, as we approached the end of World War II, that the United States began to look toward the future and saw the critical importance of the Middle East, most especially, and to some people this will appear very mercenary, but in fact it was quite practical. The Middle East would be a major source of the world's energy because of its enormous resources, oil, and subsequently discovered gas. And so that's when the United States, February 1945, when Roosevelt meets with Ibn Saud in the Bitter Lakes aboard the USS Quincy, and begins to form a relationship with the King of Saudi Arabia. And I do want to underscore, they had two negotiating sessions on board the Quincy, and it was really quite a colorful affair because Ibn Saud brings, I forget how many goats on board to slaughter in order to offer a feast to the US president. But in those conversations, they never discussed oil, not once, never came up in the conversation. It was certainly understood that the United States was most interested in cultivating a relationship with respect to Saudi Arabia and its oil resources. And from the perspective of the Saudis, that they were very interested in attracting American oil companies. But that would happen in due course. What in fact they did spend their time discussing was the disposition of the Jews of Europe and trying to settle them in Palestine. And of course, Ibn Saud was resolutely opposed to it.
So even before Israel was formed, Israel was in the picture.
Absolutely.
And so 1945, when Roosevelt and Ibn Saud met, it's also a time the British were playing a very canny, or maybe not so canny, but a very determined game to stay relevant. And they certainly wanted access to oil in Saudi Arabia. Of course, they screwed up, and they screwed up big time. That's been the subject of many a book and many a documentary. A little bit on the intra-Anglo rivalry between the US and the UK in the Middle East, sir.
Well, the British, of course, were interested in preserving their global empire, starting first with India, but also the Middle East. And in the Middle East, after India, probably their second biggest interest would have been Egypt because of the canal, and maybe on a similar level, Iran because of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, today better known as British Petroleum or BP. And so, I mean, those were the three key areas of interest of the Brits. And of course, two of those relate very directly to the Middle East and ensuing events. The Brits saw themselves as the principal operator in the Gulf at large. They had, well, effective colonies in what is today the United Arab Emirates. They had a strong relationship, although it wasn't a colony, with the Sultanate of Oman, and similar ties with the current countries of the Gulf. This was all pre-Gulf independence, and therefore saw themselves as in the privileged position of dealing with Saudi Arabia. But as they said, as you indicated, they kind of shot themselves in the foot when they drew the conclusion, grossly erroneously, that there was no oil to be found in Saudi Arabia. One a British petroleum explorer, as they were packing up their drill rigs and etc., famously commented that if there's a drop of oil in this country, I will eat my hat. The Americans took a more humble approach and a more persistent approach. It took them years before they did find oil, but they did indeed find oil in the eastern part of the country, and it became very apparent that Saudi Arabia's reserves were quite sizable. And this is before we had all the technology that's available today, or even 30 or 50 years ago, to truly estimate the size of Saudi reserves, but they are mammoth. And it was the United States who was able
They
to
were drilling good
capitalize.
old Texan style.
Yeah, they had a bunch of good old Texas boys, wildcatters, doing their thing, and pushing it to the limits. And indeed, were able to discover oil. And the rest, of course, is history. But that served as a launching pad for the ensuing relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States. And of course, any country sitting on something so valuable, but yet presenting itself as so vulnerable, would need some kind of a patron. And of course, that patron could be none other than the only superpower of the day at the end of World War II, and that was the United States. And that was what Ibn Saud, otherwise known as King Abdulaziz, was looking for when he met with President Roosevelt. And it got off to, I think, a very positive start, not as positive as Roosevelt would have wanted in terms of resettlement of European Jews, but nevertheless, that marked sort of a historic moment in the U.S. engagement in the Middle East. And from that point, of course, it just blossomed.
Okay, so the US comes out on top, but we go to 1953 from here. Or rather, let's get to Israel. 1948, Israel is formed. The Arab countries invade Israel. They are beaten back. Israel survives. Saudi Arabia is not one of the invading parties, but of course, it's not exactly jumping up and down with joy at the formation of Israel. And then fast forward 5 years, 1953, the MI6 and CIA-led coup in Tehran occurs, throws or overthrows Mohammad Mossadegh, the democratically elected leader of Iran, who is problematic, but not communist by any stretch of imagination. And we get the installation of the Shah, who's weak effete and later turns out to be both corrupt and extraordinarily extravagant. So many people call that original sin in the Middle East. So walk us through how that happens.
Exactly. Iran represents the United States' first, and some would argue, major disaster, though it was not apparent at the time, when we finally took up the baton from the British in engineering the coup that overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh, who was, as you indicated, largely a Democrat. Certainly for that part of the world, we would say, liberal thinking. Lots of things he wanted to do, lots of things he espoused. When he became prime minister, his security forces were ready to pounce on some commentators in the media for criticizing him. And he said, no, let them speak freely. I mean, that's extraordinary at any time in the history of the Middle East, and most especially during the early 1950s. And so he showed most certainly positive signs of moving Iran in the direction of the region's, it would be second democracy, of course, by that time after Israel. And Britain was in a very difficult financial situation following the end of the war. They were piling up debt. They even had to go to the IMF in order to get some bridge financing. They were truly in a difficult position. And right at that same time, Mossadegh decides to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, BP.
Gary, very quickly, he nationalized only after they refused to give Iran the same deal that the Americans had with Saudi Arabia. All he wanted was a 50-50 split in revenues. They were giving 16 or 17 cents to a dollar, and they were cheating on that too by fudging the books or cooking.
It's not clear that he would have settled for that. That particular offer was actually put on the table by the Americans because the Iranians and the British sought American intervention to resolve this. Britain did not want to lose the exorbitant profits they were gaining from this relationship. They effectively were the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and they did not want to give this up, particularly at a time of financial distress. And so it's not clear the British were willing to settle for anything other than some marginal
but I'm saying the
concessions.
Mossadegh would have settled. British didn't. The British proved intransigent.
Yeah, well, it never got to that point because the British would not have accepted it. And the Americans almost threw up their hands. In fact, eventually did, because Eisenhower had dispatched State Department negotiators and some very heavy hitters from the oil industry to say, look, this is the deal the American oil companies were able to cut with Saudi Arabia. It's a pretty good deal, 50-50. And the Brits rejected it out of hand because the Brits were only willing to settle, I think, for a maximum of giving 20% to the Iranians. What Mossadegh would have settled for, we will never know. He was a bit intransigent. I mean, he was very stubborn, sometimes very emotional and difficult to deal with. And this is all documented in now released cable traffic between our embassy in Tehran and Washington. The Americans are pulling their hair out, that both sides were immovable over this issue. And the Brits, in the meantime, began plotting this coup and shortly realized that chances of pulling it off successfully were very limited without outside help. And that outside help inevitably meant turning to the United States. And so it was initially posed to Harry Truman, and Truman rejected it out of hand. Now, this was approaching the end of the Truman administration, 1952, during the election in which Truman did not run. And so he rejected it. Eisenhower wins the election and takes office in January 1953. And sometime in the winter to early spring of 53, the CIA comes back to Eisenhower, the new president, and presents the plan to him. He listens patiently, but does not sign off on it. I won't say he refused it, but he certainly was not ready to act on it. Meanwhile, the disaster continues to unfold in London and Tehran. American intervention, World Bank intervention to try and resolve this. And I think the Brits by that time had made up their minds that they were going to take the coup route and they were going to put pressure on the Americans. The CIA believed very confidently they could do this. And come the summer of 1953, they send, I think it's the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, Kermit Roosevelt, who fancied himself a Middle East expert. He was not, to Iran to
Did he speak
plan.
Farsi?
No, he did not speak Farsi. I don't. He didn't speak Arabic. He didn't speak any Middle Eastern language. So it didn't stop him, and he thought he had a pretty solid plan. And by August of '53, the plan was again presented to Eisenhower. So why did he approve it then? Hysteria is
McCarthy years. We've
the
talked about
single
it.
answer.
These were the McCarthy years, and they were
This is the
seen.
communist hysteria that gripped the United States. And some people just want to wave it off or dismiss it. But no, this was real. This was something very tangible that every American felt, that this was this mammoth communist threat. By this time, the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, as did we. So we were not going to intimidate the Soviets in any way with our nuclear weapons. And there was fear that the communists were everywhere. And this coincided, of course, with the nationalist.
Behind every lamppost, as you once said.
Behind every lamppost. And this coincided with the nationalist anti-colonialist movement that was beginning to take grip in all the colonial possessions of the colonial powers, most especially Britain and France. But the Americans, who had no colonies, seemed most fearful of this. You couldn't say communism without preceding the term with godless. And of course, that really shook Americans to the bone, to the soul, I would say. And as a result, there was this almost massive wave within America that we had to confront the communist threat. And of course, the greatest illustration of that was Joe McCarthy, who accused the Soviet Union of having successfully embedded communists throughout the American government, further heightening the fears, the paranoia that had taken grip in the United States. He especially went after the State Department and a number of career diplomats had their careers spoiled by Joe McCarthy because of his accusations of being communist sympathizers. And as it was, and by the way, this also coincided with the rise of the People's Republic of China and a debate revolving around who lost China, and everybody was pointing a finger at those liberal communist sympathizers in the State Department. No, they were not sympathizers, but they certainly had a pretty extensive knowledge of China and what was transpiring in China, certainly more than anyone else, and they were ignored. But in the case of Iran, this fear pretty much overrode all other concerns, including the fact that a number of folks had pointed out that this was overriding America's values, and that Mossadegh, although unpredictable, sometimes emotional, and clearly uncooperative in some cases, i.e., your typical flawed leader, we had to remove him. And thus the coup unfolded. Interesting to note that the first attempt at the coup failed, and the CIA in Washington had ordered the coup planners in the agency office in Tehran to pull up anchor. Let's go. Let's get out of there. We tried. We gave it our best effort, and we have to move on. Mossadegh, his colossal error is that he did not arrest the Iranian coup plotters. Both the Brits and the Americans had organized quite a few Iranians who would collaborate in this effort, including Iranian media, who were spreading all kinds of lies about Mossadegh and what he was planning to do in terms of Iranian society. And that was all going to be abandoned from Washington's perspective because we couldn't pull it off. Be that as it may, Kermit Roosevelt nevertheless decided he still had a few irons in the fire. He went to this Iranian general and said, we need to act quickly to muster your troops. And they did move quickly. And within days, they were able to take possession of the radio station, the media, and some of the other main control facilities in Iran, and ultimately arrested Mossadegh. Simultaneously with all of this, there was the effort to get the Shah to sign a decree removing Mossadegh from his position. And the Shah was reluctant to do it, mostly because he lacked spine, he lacked gumption, he lacked courage, he lacked commitment, determination, drive, all of these things you'd kind of like to see in a leader. And to the point where the U.S. ambassador said, this is not going to work. He is not someone who's going to play ball. He just lacks the strength of character to pull this off as a national leader. The United States went so far to roust up his twin sister, the Shah's twin sister, from the casinos in France and haul her back to Iran to try and talk some courage into her brother. He did not want to see her for quite some time, but eventually relented, and she persuaded him to go along with this, to sign off on the decrees. And indeed, he did do that, thereby making the coup official. Buried in all of that, and this is really important today, is that the clerical class, including some very prominent clerics, eventually sided with the coup plotters. Not so much with the United States, although they doubtlessly knew that the US and the Brits were behind this, but with the Iranians who were involved in this, Zahedi especially, and the clerical class were joined the coup. Not so much in the actual removal process, but in supporting the removal of Mossadegh, which is an important factor to consider when we look at Iran today, or Iran in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution. My own personal view is this was a colossal mistake that continues to hound the United States to this day. If a sinner pays for his crimes for 7 generations, my suspicion, I haven't done the counting, but we still have a few more generations to go before the dispute between America and Iran is ultimately resolved. It seemed like there were some brief glimpses of opportunities, and maybe we'll touch on those. But for the most part, the American coup turned out to be a disaster. A final footnote to all of this was after the success and well, they didn't do high fives in those days, but the backslapping and so forth, that they had done it. One very prescient CIA analyst wrote in a brief to the White House that this could come back to haunt the United States at some point in the future. And indeed, he was 100% correct.
Okay, so 1953, the US goes along, conducts the coup, a historic blunder. But then 1956, Suez happens. The British and the French, along with the Israelis, intervene to take control of the Suez Canal. And the US clips the wings, not just of the Israelis, but also of the British and the French. And the British Empire, you could argue, in a way, dies. Soon the East of Suez speech follows, and hereafter, the top dog in the Middle East and in the world is just the US, at least in the Western side. It's the US and, of course, in the Soviet Union. But the third rail, or the third power, great power, which Winston Churchill imagined the British Commonwealth, the British Empire to be, is now dead.
Yes, it is. And uh, one one point in all this is that Britain, France, and Israel conspired behind the Americans' back. There were a couple of meetings that took place among senior officials from the three governments outside of Paris, in which the plan was hatched for the British, the French, and later the Israelis to retake the canal. The reason being that, not unlike what had happened in Iran, 3 years previous, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the very charismatic president of Egypt, wanted to nationalize the Suez Canal Company. When the British, and of course the British, who were the major shareholder, the French were second, when the British presented this to the Americans, Americans did not get anywhere near as exercised as the British were. The Americans did a sober assessment of Egyptian capabilities for managing and operating the canal and reached the conclusion, which they presented to the White House, that no, the Egyptians could do this, that they had played various and sundry roles under the British, and they were now perhaps ready to move into a position where they controlled the canal. And so this was, of course, very discouraging to the British and the French, and they began to make this plan in which they would take possession through military force of the canal. How did they get the Israelis involved? Well, Nasser had closed the Strait of Tiran down in the south, which meant to any vessels going to Israel. So this cut off a very important source of goods and resources to still infant state of Israel. And so they were all ready to join this plan with the British and the French. They all three believed that if they were to pull this off and show it to be successful, it would present the Americans with a fait accompli, and they would have to go along with it. Well, history intervened, and a number of things happened. First, Eisenhower saw this in purely colonial terms, and unbeknownst to many, Dwight Eisenhower was a virulent anti-colonialist. He attributed World War II in part to the colonial powers and their avarice in terms of maintaining their colonial possessions, whether it was in Asia or in Africa or in the Middle East. And so he saw the British, French, and Israeli plan as simply an extension of colonialism. That is, an effort to preserve the colonial empires of Britain and France. And he wanted no part of that. But probably more important than that is that the period of the attempted takeover. And by the way, the Brits had landed troops in Egypt, and the Israelis had already started moving Egyptian forces across the Sinai toward the Suez Canal. But around that same period, in 1956, there was a revolt in Hungary to overthrow a communist government, which had become a client state of the Soviet Union, and the United States had taken a very, very strong position in opposition to a great power like the Soviet Union imposing itself on Hungary with the invasion of Soviet troops to reestablish the communist government. And so the United States could hardly oppose the Soviet invasion of Hungary and support the British, French, Israeli invasion of Egypt. And I mean,
Might not have looked kosher.
Exactly. And but he truly did see this as an attempt to preserve the dying embers of colonialism in the Middle East. And so in a very telling speech that he gave, I can't remember the circumstances of it, what he effectively did, not in these words, is he condemned this attempt on the part of the British and the French and Israelis. What that did, it forced the British to immediately call off the invasion without the support of the United States. And by the way, they would have needed ultimately some kind of financial support from the Americans in order to successfully pull this off.
I mean, the point to note is that the pound started falling the moment the US came out against the invasion, and it was
Exactly.
almost in free fall. And that would have decimated the British economy, which was already in dire trouble, which was already coming to the International Monetary Fund with a begging bowl. And they had no option but to eat humble pie.
Exactly. And the person who really comes off as the hero in all of this is, of course, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who used this to capitalize on his efforts in establishing this pan-Arab nationalist movement. He was already extremely popular in Egypt, and this just catapulted him in popularity, not only in his own country, but throughout the Arab world. And the United States kind of gets an also mentioned, and that Eisenhower did stand up and oppose this. And so the United States still looks good to most of the population of the Middle East, Iran notwithstanding, and was probably one of the high points of U.S. foreign policy. The downside, and I don't necessarily consider it a downside, is that the United States still found it very, very difficult to form a constructive relationship with Nasser, who tried to play the Soviets off against the United States throughout his presidency. And of course, this leads to a disastrous mistake on his part by leaving his country vulnerable in 1967 when the Israelis will launch an attack on Egypt, and the country is unprepared, partly because he had dispatched significant numbers of Egyptian forces and some of their top military commanders to Yemen, and that civil war, to fight on behalf of the movement that was trying to overthrow the royalists in Yemen. And so he did not have the troops that he needed to blunt the Israeli attack. And after 6 days, he was forced to call for a truce, and the Israelis were left in possession of the Sinai.
Well,
all of it.
You've mentioned 1967. The Israelis got all of Sinai. That is also the year they got Gaza. That was under Egyptian control. At that time, if I remember correctly, the population was roughly 350,000. Now it's over 2 million.
Correct.
The Israelis also beat back another socialist power to their east, Syria. They got the Golan Heights. So all in all, it was a spectacular war that changed Israel forever. But Nasser doesn't last that long. 1973 happens. And in 1973, Israel first suffers a setback and then comes back. But the bottom line in 1973 is there's an oil crisis and the entire Middle East changes complexion. Tell us a little bit more about the impact of 1973 and the US role thereafter.
Well, 1973 was another truly watershed moment, certainly far more so in terms of the U.S. role in the Middle East than 67 was. And that was simply because Nasser had left the scene. By the way, he had resigned after the humiliating defeat in 67. The Egyptian people loved him and still wanted him back. He came back, but he died, I think, in 70 or 71 from a heart attack, and he was succeeded by Anwar Sadat, who was a close confidant of Nasser. Not quite as charismatic, but certainly every bit as much driven. And it was under Sadat's leadership that the Egyptians turned the table, so to speak, on the Israelis and launched a surprise attack on Israel. And And for the first few days, it looked as though the Egyptians would drive across the Sinai and directly into Israel. As it turned out, Sadat had no intention of doing that. What he wanted to do was bloody the Israeli noses and give them such a shock that they would eventually come to the negotiating table so that Sadat could negotiate a return of the Sinai to Egypt and they could reach some kind of an accommodation. So in some sense, he was far more far-sighted than Nasser was in terms of the realities of the relationship between Egypt and Israel and what the possibilities were. What was key in 1973 is that because of that initial defeat in the first few days of Israel and the loss of extraordinary amounts of military equipment and manpower, they were forced to call on the United States. And the United States did reciprocate and provided Israel with the war material, all the weapons and supplies that they needed in order to turn the tables and begin to advance in the Sinai and move toward the Suez Canal and potentially even onto Cairo. And this is where we see very, very active diplomacy on the part of the United States in the person of Henry Kissinger, then Nixon's
Shuttle diplomacy, the word came into being, as you told me last time, or not last time, when we talked about Kissinger.
Yes, I mean, the concept of shuttle diplomacy has been around for eons, but both he and subsequently Jimmy Carter thought that they had discovered something new. In any event, he embarked on the shuttle diplomacy between Cairo, Tel Aviv, the then capital of Israel, and of course Moscow, who had been supporting strongly Egypt, but not nearly as strongly as Washington was its ally, Israel. And Sadat very perceptively realized that the real playmaker was in the future was not going to be Russia or the Soviet Union. It was going to be the United States. And Kissinger picked up on this and was able to negotiate a deal in which the Israelis, who had surrounded the Egyptian Eighth Army in the very south of the Sinai near Port Said, backed off. It turns out they really had no intention of annihilating the Eighth Army, though they could have. They backed off. They moved back across the Suez and into the Sinai, and they reached an understanding that ended the war. And the Russians were not, or the Soviets were not part of this. The Soviets had wanted to be a part of it, had proposed that the U.S. and the Soviet Union jointly work together to resolve the crisis. But I think Kissinger saw that the United States was quickly in a position of having the upper hand and negotiating the end of this. And part of that grand bargain was that Sadat would expel the remaining Soviet advisors. He had already begun to expel many of them and would form a relationship that Egypt previously had with the Soviet Union with the United States now, including receiving benefits from American largesse. And it began the process of negotiations to end the conflict between Egypt and Israel, which started in Geneva, but progressed very, very slowly. And we have to wait until we get to the presidency of Jimmy Carter, where frustrations were beginning to build. Sadat was beginning to take the initiative on his own and had reached out repeatedly to negotiate directly with the Israelis, who refused. But then he proposed doing something that was truly revolutionary. It was in diplomacy, things tend to happen in a linear fashion. This was about as non-linear as you could ever imagine, and that was he proposed to go to Israel and speak directly to the Israeli people, and in particular to the Israeli Knesset, where he proposed negotiating a peace with Israel, a permanent peace, which would include the return of the Sinai to Egypt. It was at that point that the Egyptians or the Israelis realized that saying no would be more costly than sitting at the table. and saying, "Tell me more." And that's exactly what happened. So it sort of teed up Carter's initiative when he hosted Camp David in the early part of his administration. I want to say 1977, and brokered in 13 days the peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. Well, the peace agreement, but it wasn't a final treaty. That would have to await later in his presidency, 1979. But it dragged out for some time. But it was truly an extraordinary accomplishment by a single individual, and we really cannot dismiss the personalities involved. First of all three heads of state, Jimmy Carter, Anwar Sadat, and at that time, Menachem Begin, were all very religious men, extremely religious. And so they had that sort of connection, even though they were three different faiths, they had that connection and were able to connect in a way that maybe another US president never would have been able to do, or another Egyptian president or Israeli. Be that as it may, without Jimmy Carter there, and to really push this through, he embarked on his own miniature version of shuttle diplomacy, because after the first round of meetings among the three heads of state, it was clear that Begin and Sadat could not get along, could not even be in the same room with one another. And so Carter and his senior aides began shuttling between the cabins at Camp David. It's a retreat for the president, and it has a number of cabins up there. And so he was going back and forth between the cabins with the various versions of texts that were being negotiated. And ultimately, when Sadat threatened to leave, he met him out just before he boarded the helicopter, and said if he wanted to leave, he was certainly free to leave, but he had made a promise. And Carter was hoping that Sadat would keep the promise. So Sadat returned to negotiations, and thankfully they were able to reach an understanding. Now, it took some time to negotiate all the details, including the phased withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Sinai, and that also required the intervention of Jimmy Carter and his Secretary of State at that time, Cyrus Vance. And it was truly an extraordinary accomplishment on the part of President Carter. It was Sadat and Begin who got the Nobel Prize. Carter should have. He subsequently got it in 2002 for his work with the Carter Center, but in recognition of the exceptional work he had done in brokering this peace accord. And with that, it transformed the Middle East and the Arab-Israeli conflict, because without Egypt joining other Arab states, there really was no way that any coalition of Arab states would be able to challenge Israel or threaten Israel the way they had before with Egypt, which had the largest and best armed, best trained of all the Arab armies. And so it was a transformational event, engineered, well, because we had two very willing national leaders in Begin and Sadat, but through the efforts of Jimmy Carter.
So since then, the Middle East becomes an American lake, or an American outpost of sorts, because the Soviets are expelled, the Egyptians and the Israelis have now kissed and made up. Syria is practically defanged now, because Syria by itself cannot attack Israel. Jordan already is coming along. It makes its peace. And the US soon has bases in places like Qatar and other parts of the Middle East. So it's very much just not the oil crisis, notwithstanding. 1973 did hike the oil price up, did lead to the collapse of Bretton Woods, but geopolitically now the US is the top dog in the Middle East. Correct?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about it. I mean, after 73, the last Soviet toehold was in Syria. which the U.S. was willing to effectively write off. But most of the other Arab states were coming around and cutting their own deals with the United States in terms of military security relationships, enhanced trade and economic relations, and so forth. Most especially Saudi Arabia, which continued to see the United States as backstopping them in the event of a threat from an external power, whether it be the Soviet Union, which never materialized, or someone else, which eventually became Iran. And so, yeah, the United States was without question the top power. It really had, I don't know that it necessarily sought hegemony in the Middle East, but that's effectively what it had, to the point that in the ensuing negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians, which started in 1988, the United States played a critical role, and most of the countries deferred to the United States in terms of shepherding of that through the whole peace process, and the United States played a critical role in all of that. Although we have to give due note to the Norwegians and their indispensable role in the first Oslo Accords of 1993. But the United States was there at the signing and there for Oslo II and so forth. So the United States was really kind of rolling up his hands and inserting itself into the most divisive issues that were plaguing the region at the time. And much of that centered around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
So the setback is really 1979 and Iran. The Iranian Revolution, when it occurs, is the only real setback to the US in the region. And you could argue that plays out till today. Iran is the US enemy in the region till today.
Oh, without question. And, the United States had this sort of twin pillars policy up until 79 with Saudi Arabia and Iran, that with these two major powers, and not coincidentally, the major oil exporting countries on the US side, the US pretty much had the Middle East knitted together in a way that served US interests, which continued to be keeping the Soviets at bay when it came to the Middle East, and trying to tamp down all potential areas of conflict. Well, not all, but the key one being, of course, the Israelis and the Palestinians. In 94, of course, King Hussein finally comes around and negotiates a peace and normalization agreement with Israel. And so that particular piece is taken off the board. It wasn't particularly critical, except for the fact that Jordan borders Israel. And so Israel now had a very welcome buffer on its eastern border in terms of a friendly nation. Friendly, certainly in the terms of King Hussein, who, by the way, never joined the 1973 war the way he had in 67. He sort of gave verbal support, political support, but he didn't commit his forces to the actual combat. And the Israelis were aware of that, and that's why there was no fighting between Israel and Jordan in the 73 war. In any event, the real focus of American involvement, certainly in the 90s, was the effort to broker a peace. And as it became, by the end of the 90s and the year 2000, ultimately a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And Bill Clinton effectively took up the baton in the same fashion that Jimmy Carter had, and invites the two leaders, Yasser Arafat from the Palestinian side, Ehud Barak from the Israeli side, to Camp David for a number of days of intensive negotiations, where Israel presents its most far-reaching proposal to the Palestinians for a Palestinian state. As it had often been throughout these painful negotiations previously and subsequently to this day, The real sticking point, or points I should say, would be right of return. These are Palestinians who either were forced to leave or left Palestine when Israel became independent in 1948, and the status of Jerusalem, because both Israel and the Palestinians claimed Israel as their national capitals. So that's obviously a point of contention. I think borders, they got extremely close, and in security, they were able to get pretty close in terms of negotiating the interests of both sides. But unable to solve those two issues, the talks did carry on at the initiative of the Israelis and the Palestinians, less so of the Americans. And it was down in Taba 6-7 months later. This is a beach town on the Red Sea in Egypt, where the two sides met and came extraordinarily close, probably the closest they have ever been to reaching an agreement on two states. And that included borders and Jerusalem, and even the right of return of Palestinians. But that was all torpedoed when Arafat launched the Second Intifada. It actually had begun weeks before. And with the launch of the Second Intifada, any chance of a peace agreement had gone by the boards. Moreover, of course, Bill Clinton left office in January 2001 and was succeeded by George W. Bush, who, truth be told, at least at that time in his presidency, had little to no interest in picking up the baton from Bill Clinton and try to negotiate a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that's where it's set, with the Intifada, of course, raging throughout, especially the West Bank, but also Gaza and even into Israel.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.